The surge in mobile information use and social media sharing, combined with accessible technologies for creating and distributing non-consensual materials, increases the risk of online violence against women and girls in Asia. Are there legal mechanisms to shield them from this gender-based violence and hold perpetrators accountable? Explore the hurdles women face in addressing this issue and assess government vigilance and awareness with Daron, Associate International Legal Advisor of the International Commission of Jurists.
Hi Daron, could you please tell me about the trend of online violence against women and girls in Asia?
Some of the common forms of online violence against women and girls, or online gender-based violence for short, have included non-consensual distribution of intimate content. Sexual harassment online is also a big issue, as well as online threats of physical or sexual violence. Another big issue we've also observed would be doxing, which is the non-consensual sharing of private information such as someone's contact details with malicious intent. One newer trend that we are also observing is the use of generative AIs, such as deepfakes, to create and distribute non-consensual, synthetic, intimate images and videos, which can have a very traumatizing effect on victim survivors.
And how could this impact women living in countries where existing legal mechanisms already put them at a disadvantage?
Women and girls who are victim survivors of gender-based violence face numerous barriers, right, to access justice and effective redress due to various structural and institutional reasons. And so these same concerns apply regardless of whether or not the violence takes place offline or online. And in fact, I think because there are newer forms of violence being perpetrated through the use of technology, this has created additional challenges and additional barriers for women and girls to be able to effectively access justice, as law enforcement and criminal justice systems may not be adequately sensitized to how technology, new and emerging technologies can create new forms of violence that may have new impacts on women and girls. This problem is exacerbated for women with intersecting forms of discrimination, such as discrimination based on nationality, discrimination based on sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, disability status, and so these create additional barriers for women and girls to be able to effectively access justice.
Does the level of digital literacy play a role as well? For example, if they lack proficiency in digital technologies and equipment, they might be susceptible to exploitation, rendering them more vulnerable.
For sure. I think this is definitely one big issue that we've been observing in our work. I think a lot of the work and a lot of the reports that we're seeing of online gender-based violence, these violence tend to be reported more from urban areas, right? But it doesn't mean that this violence is also not happening in rural areas. In fact, I think what we know is that these numbers are likely to be severely underreported. I think the lack of digital literacy and the lack of education also feeds into this problem as well, because for some victim survivors may not actually realize that what they're experiencing online is actually a form of violence, and they may not be aware as well of what mechanisms are available to them for protection. A lot more, I think, needs to be done in order to diagnose the problem so that we can effectively respond and protect women and girls regardless of where they live, regardless of their socioeconomic status, from all forms of violence, including online violence.
What's tougher when dealing with harmful online content against women and girls? Stopping it from getting out there, or trying to take it down after it's already out?
So I would say that both are equally challenging. They're challenging for different reasons. What is important is that we need to make sure that there are clear legal mechanisms both to prevent as well as to remove content, harmful online content that is published on the internet. We need to make sure that there are these protective mechanisms in place that are exercised with due process and with sufficient safeguards and oversight as well in order to prevent abuse. This is a particularly challenging area of responding to online violence, partly because it also requires very, very close cooperation between various stakeholders, including the courts, the judiciary, law enforcement agencies, as well as internet intermediaries. And some countries may not necessarily have these frameworks in place in order to enable cooperation between all these different parties. Another issue also would be in terms of extraterritorial reach, because the internet has no borders, right? And so it's very common that you would have perpetrators who are not based in the same country as the victim survivor, and that also creates big problems when it comes to law enforcement and criminal justice and having to access justice for these forms of violence.
What should be the basis for prosecuting and punishing these offences?
Yeah, so under international human rights law, online gender-based violence should be clearly prohibited and criminalized. So it's very clear. This is the guidance from international human rights law. But if and only if it amounts to a violation of the physical, sexual, or psychological integrity of victim survivors. So criminal laws should only prohibit online gender-based violence that inflict substantial harm to the human rights of victim survivors, and we need to ensure as well that these laws are consistent with human rights, including by being non-discriminatory and proportionate to the gravity of the offense. One thing that we always emphasize in terms of laws responding to online gender-based violence is that these laws must be gender inclusive, and they must be premised as well on the absence of freely given consent and take into account coercive circumstances and unequal power dynamics between the perpetrators and the victim survivors.
What kind of legal protection should be given to victims and survivors of online violence?
Yeah, so victim survivors face particular risks when they decide to come forward with their experiences of sexual violence, be it offline or online. And so we must ensure that laws that seek to respond to online gender-based violence or any form of gender-based violence must be victim-centric and take into account these particular risks that victim survivors face. And so some of the protective mechanisms that the ICJ has emphasized as being important in order to ensure that the rights of victims are protected would be provisions that protect the privacy of complainants and witnesses. We also need to ensure that victim survivors are also protected from reprisals. So one common problem that has been reported across various jurisdictions, including Indonesia, which is one of the countries that we focus on, would be when victim survivors come forward with their claims, they then face legal reprisals from their perpetrators. Oftentimes, in fact, we know that victim survivors don't actually want to go through the full criminal justice process because it can be very re-traumatizing, it can be very time-consuming, and it's overall just very exhausting for victim survivors. So sometimes in instances when victim survivors have had their content published online, they just want to remove the content and make sure that it doesn't spread anymore. So we need to make sure as well that embedded within these laws that respond to OGBV, to online gender-based violence, it should include mechanisms to prevent and take down harmful online content in a manner that's done with sufficient due process and safeguards. And of course, protection orders are also another important form of protective mechanism, just to make sure that victim survivors are able to feel safe from reprisals and from retaliation from their perpetrators.
Do you think governments may view it as a low priority when it comes to issuing protection orders? For example, they may not consider online violence as something on top of their agenda simply because it doesn't involve physical harm.
Yeah. No, for sure. I think there is still this perception, right, and this stereotype that online violence is not as serious as offline violence, and I think that's something that we've been working very hard to change the narrative of as well, because online violence can be just as serious, if not more serious in certain circumstances than offline violence. And so we shouldn't distinguish between whether or not the violence takes place online or offline. The most important thing is recognizing that these forms of violence create harms and trauma for the victim survivors, and so we need to make sure that we have sufficient laws that are implemented effectively effectively as well in order to protect all women and girls from online violence.
And what kind of reparations should be in place for victims and survivors?
So it's very important to ensure that there is a right to an effective remedy that is respected and protected for all victims of violence, including gender-based violence that takes place online. And so some forms of effective remedies and reparations can include monetary compensation, restitution, rehabilitation, as well as guarantees of non-repetition.
When we talk about the provision of legal and protective mechanisms to address this issue, what actions need to be taken and what are areas of priority?
So I think one area of priority in terms of legal and protective mechanisms would be reviewing existing laws to see whether or not they adequately respond to all forms of online gender-based violence. I think countries are still a little bit slow in responding to this issue. I think there is an increasing recognition of the problem, but there may not be adequate laws in place currently to make sure that there is effective protection against all forms of online gender-based violence. So one thing that would be of urgent priority, I think, would be for all states to go back and to review their laws.
What has the International Commission of Jurists done to address this issue? How has the ICJ worked in this area?
So the ICJ has been working very hard to attempt to respond to this issue of online gender-based violence and to understand the nuances around this issue and to figure out as well what is the best way to respond in a way that's consistent with human rights law. So one useful resource that we published earlier this year is what we call our OGBV law checklist, our online gender-based violence law checklist that really aims to serve as a tool for legislators and policy makers to come up with new laws or to amend existing laws that would ensure comprehensive protection for women and girls against online gender-based violence. We published this guidance in response to a gap that we noticed because there wasn't a lot of guidance in terms of how exactly these laws should look like, and so this OGBV law checklist aimed to fill that gap. So the guidelines give guidance on the forms of OGBV that should be criminalized. It also gives guidance on the protective mechanisms that should be in place as well to ensure that victim survivors' rights are protected through this process of undergoing the criminal justice system, and also guidance as well on what remedies and reparations should look like, amongst other forms of guidance. So this OGBV law checklist has served as the basis of our work on different countries, including Indonesia and the Philippines. And so earlier this year in Indonesia, we released a briefing paper that analyzes the recently enacted sexual violence crimes law, which does contain a section focusing on online gender-based violence. And some of the issues that we highlighted that were gathered in consultation with various stakeholders included the definition of OGBV and whether or not the protections inside covered all forms of OGBV that should be criminalized under international human rights law. We also looked at the availability of the protection mechanisms, including mechanisms on preventing and removing harmful online content, to assess whether or not they are sufficient and whether or not they are comprehensive enough. And so these concerns have been raised bilaterally with legislators, policymakers, justice actors, the judiciary, and they've been very receptive to the findings of the briefing paper, and we hope to be able to continue this engagement. So another country that we've been doing a fair bit of work on this issue of online violence against women and girls would be the Philippines. And so we prepared a shadow report ahead of the Philippines review under CEDAW, which is the Convention Against All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and Girls. So we prepared a shadow report and submitted it to the CEDAW committee. And one particular issue that we highlighted in our shadow report centered around online gender-based violence. Because the Philippines does have some good laws focused on online gender-based violence, but there are still gaps both in terms of the design of these laws as well as the implementation of these laws. And so we highlighted some of these concerns to the CEDAW committee, and during the review by the CEDAW committee of the Philippines, some of the questions that were asked by the CDAW committee reflected exactly the submissions that we made. And this submission that we did to the Philippines and the analysis that we did inside has also served as the cornerstone for some of our engagements in the Philippines as well.
In the coming years, what does ICJ plan to do to deal with this issue?
So of course, we hope to continue working on this issue, maybe expand our analysis to other countries as well, and maybe expand it to a global level as well. The fact that there are constantly new technologies being developed means that there will be new forms of challenges and new forms of violence that come up, and so it's important for us to keep on our toes and to respond to all these different developments. And we've already started doing some of that thinking. For example, we prepared a submission to the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression focused on gender disinformation, which is a very new issue that requires a lot of thinking in terms of not just what gender disinformation would constitute, but also what is the best way to respond in a way that ensures that we're effectively protecting people against violence, but still respecting the rights to freedom of expression and information online. So we hope to be able to continue responding to some of these contemporary challenges. Another challenge that I can foresee would be, for example, the role of artificial intelligence as well, and its impacts on online gender-based violence in terms of creating new forms of violence or ensuring or causing the easier spread of violence.
There are many organizations and actors already working on this issue, especially on human rights protection. So what makes the ICJ distinctive?
So I think the ICJ's niche really is our legal expertise. And I think while a lot of people are starting to recognize online gender-based violence as being an issue, and being an issue that requires a legal response as well, there is a lot less thinking in terms of what exactly these legal responses should look like. And so I think this is really where the ICJ, we hope to be able to bring a legal expertise in order to shape not just domestic conversations, but global conversations about what, for example, a law that responds to a certain form of online violence, what that should look like, how do we ensure that we're doing it in a way that's consistent with human rights and the rule of law. I think another expertise that we have as well is our close engagement with justice actors in the different countries that we work in. And we know that especially for this issue of online gender-based violence, it requires close cooperation between many different actors.